We're now going to move to opening statements and get this debate underway. I just want to remind all of you and our debaters about our countdown clock. When you see the countdown clock for our debaters' time segments, their opening remarks, their rebuttals, and their closing remarks, join me in a loud round of applause. That'll keep them on their toes and our debate on schedule. Fantastic. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're underway. Stephen Walt, you're up first with 6 minutes on the clock.
Great. This is a debate between realists and crusaders. We all believe the United States should be actively engaged in the world and support a rules-based order. What we're debating is whether America should be a crusader state that tries to remake the world by overthrowing other governments. Our opponents say yes, we say no. In our view, the United States should use its power to deter or defeat attacks on the United States and to uphold the balance of power in critical regions. It made good sense for the United States to enter World War II. Japan attacked us, Germany declared war, and both countries were great powers engaged in vast wars of aggression. During the Cold War, American leaders were right to forge and lead an alliance to contain the Soviet Union. We believe the first Bush administration was correct in leading the effort to expel Iraq from Kuwait, to keep it from dominating the Persian Gulf. But President Bush acted with restraint. He wisely chose not to go to Baghdad to topple Saddam Hussein. His son, George W. Bush, made a different choice in 2003, even though Iraq was no longer a major threat and had no weapons of mass destruction. You all know how that crusade turned out. The resolution today, as Rudyard said, comes from a famous speech given by former President John Quincy Adams in 1821. To put Adams' remarks in modern terms, he was saying that America should not use its power to do regime change. We agree. As John will explain, toppling foreign governments to promote democracy almost always makes things worse. Replacing another country's political system is a vast social engineering project, usually done in places we barely understand, and the typical result is not a vibrant democracy, but chaos, destruction, and thousands of innocent dead. If you have any doubts, just look what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya, or consider the damage the war on Iran has caused in just 3 months. Toppling foreign governments also undermines the principle of sovereignty that is the foundation of a rules-based order. If it's okay to overthrow a government that hasn't attacked us, then what's to stop anyone from taking territory that belongs to others, as Putin did in Crimea or as Donald Trump wants to do with Greenland? If it's acceptable to use force to topple a government you don't like, it's easy to justify assassinating its leaders, imposing sanctions that harm thousands of innocent civilians, or even torturing enemy prisoners. Remember those pictures from Abu Ghraib prison with 108 Iranian schoolgirls killed by a U.S. airstrike 2 months ago? When we set out to destroy monsters, we end up doing monstrous things ourselves. Now, as realists, we know that necessity sometimes forces states to compromise their values. In World War II, for example, the United States allied with Joseph Stalin, who was a monster, to deal with a greater threat. But crusading to remake the world and sowing violence and suffering in the process does not make us safer or advance the cause of liberty. Instead of promoting freedom, we are denying it by imposing our will on others. And because we have to break a lot of rules to do it, this policy makes a mockery of our claim to support a rules-based order and gives others an excuse to break the rules themselves. Now, to be clear, we believe the United States should support the advance of liberty abroad, but primarily by creating a society in our own country that others will admire and want to emulate, rather than one that they resent or fear. And here's what I mean. The United States and South Korea have been allies for 75 years. Until the late 1980s, South Korea was a brutal military dictatorship that violently repressed pro-democracy forces and employed torture, forced labor, and occasional massacres to hold power. It wasn't North Korea, but it was far from free. Did the United States set out to overthrow it? No. Instead, it worked patiently to persuade South Korea that there was a better way. We sheltered pro-democracy exiles like Kim Dae-jung and then arranged for his safe return to his home country. And in 1987, South Koreans rose up on their own to demand an end to military rule. Today, South Korea is the 10th largest economy in the world, and according to Freedom House, it is a healthier democracy than the United States itself. The lesson is clear. Restraint works, crusading doesn't. Bottom line is that John Quincy Adams was right. America can best defend its interests, promote freedom, and foster a stable world order by setting a good example and not by engaging in an endless search for some new monster to slay. We should not be crusaders, but instead use our power with wisdom and restraint. Thank you.
Well done, Stephen. All that time in the Harvard Lecture Hall, you still had 17 seconds on the clock. We appreciate that. Mike Pompeo, you're up with 6 minutes for your opening statement.
Great. Thank you, Rudyard. And thank you for hosting us here. And appreciate you all being here tonight. It's wonderful. By the way, it's a little awkward to be the furthest to the left of anything tonight, but I'm gonna work my way through it. So the resolution talks about not hunting monsters. Right? It says we're not going to go hunt them. But at least we heard our opponents acknowledge that monsters exist. That's a good start. But of course, what history shows us is if we don't, once monsters are identified and we know who they are, if we don't pursue them, they'll come pursue us. We'll talk about those tonight at great length. And I, for one, and I think Toria would agree, we'd rather hunt them on our terms than on theirs. Professors Mearsheimer and Walt tried to frame the debate tonight in a way, but and there's so many things we do agree on. Western democracies should not go provoking. We should not go pick a fight. We shouldn't go look for a fight. We should not be in the business of creating enemies or searching for them. For our collective well-being, I hope we can all agree that there is, however, an existence of monsters, whether we pick them, create them, or otherwise. They find us. You all like country music here in Canada, right? Shania Twain, Katie Lang, Terry Carter. I have a favorite country music song. It's called Coward of the County. Kenny Rogers popularized it in the United States. And in Coward of the County, it begins with the words. It says, everyone considered him the coward of the county. His mama named him Tommy, but folks just called him Yellow. He always turned the other cheek. And according to the lyrics, his daddy told him, walk away from trouble if you can. You do not have to fight to be a man. He was bullied for years. He was thought to be a coward. But then his wife was raped by 3 men, and he shot them dead. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that vigilantism should exist and that individuals aren't different than sovereign nations. But we have to remember that evil exists. One must acknowledge that. And when it comes for you, it comes intentionally. It comes to hurt. That is the goal. That is the raison d'etre for these organizations. It's what they do. And if we do not hunt monsters, they will destroy us. It's that simple. Even Adams knew that. Doesn't require us tonight in this resolution to defend the process of figuring out who monsters are. But make no mistake, when we identify them, when they show their true colors, we must hunt them. It's our duty as sovereign leaders to protect our citizens from this evil. Monstrous acts are all around us. We see it today. Take Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Before the war started, our opponents said that Vladimir Putin didn't really want to destroy Ukraine. Ask a Ukrainian mother if that's true. They said Putin didn't have imperial ambitions. He claims he does, and he's evidenced that in every single action and his complete refusal to accept any of the terms that have been proffered. Then it was said that Ukraine couldn't hold the line, that they could not fight back against the monster. And now, 4 years on, they have demonstrated unequivocally that they can. And how about the monsters who killed 3,000 people on September 11th? It's not only fair but necessary that we pursue those monsters. A number of them, Canadian families who were killed that day, in the absence of the work that was done by Canadians and Americans alike to hunt that monster, would have yielded only more terror, more risk, and more death. Now, hunting's an interesting term. It doesn't imply that one needs to always use violence or deploy the 82nd Airborne. There are many methods of achieving that outcome. I was a CIA director. I knew a few. And hunting does indeed work best when you create a hunting party, when you want friends with you, because you never know if the monster himself is hunting in a pack, like China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea are doing today. And as much as we don't want to hunt, I'm a former soldier, no one likes war. The alternative, letting the monster grow until it has much greater capacity for destruction, is deadly and dangerous and un-American. One way or another, you must confront the monster. You know, I've been to Dover, Delaware, where we transferred the remains of our fallen soldiers and looked the families in the eye and told them that these young men and women did what was noble and decent in helping America and the world, Canada, Western civilization, hunt monsters. When they come from the shadows, we have work to do. You know, it was a monster who held the two Michaels. He held them captive. These Canadians did nothing wrong, but Xi Jinping didn't care one iota about that. In the same way that he lost no sleep when millions of people died as a result of a virus that he refused to allow the world to do the good work necessary to protect against. Western civilization, indeed basic decency, demands that our nation not be cowards of the world. And just as Tommy did his best for years to avoid picking a fight, there comes a moment. We either hunt now or fight later. And to us, the answer is clear. These folks have never met a monster that they weren't willing to downplay, deny, or explain away. But we recognize the eternal truth. In Isaiah 5:20, it says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness." Monsters are real, and when we find them, we must hunt them.
Right on the nose, Mike, well done. Up next, John Mearsheimer, your 6 minutes. Let's have your opening statement, sir.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming out to hear this debate tonight. What I'd like to do is pick up where Steve left off and talk about the costs and consequences of being a crusader state. And let me start first with the costs, the human costs of being a crusader state. Let me give you two examples. First has to do with a study that was done by the Watson Center at Brown University that looked at the number of people who have been killed, either directly through combat or indirectly, as a result of the various wars that the United States has been deeply engaged in the greater Middle East since 9/11 or since 2001. And what the Watson Center discovers is that between 4.5 million and 4.6 million people have been killed in the greater Middle East since 9/11 as a result of these wars. Let me give you another example. And this has to do with sanctions. As you know, the United States is addicted to sanctioning countries all over the world. And sanctions are often used for the purposes of regime change, which of course is what crusading is all about. There is a magazine called The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. And last August, this is August 2025, it issued a study which reported that unilateral sanctions by the United States over a 50-year period, this goes from 1971 to 2021, over that 50-year period, unilateral sanctions by the United States resulted in 28 million deaths. Just think about those numbers. This is what you get when you turn into a crusader state. Now, some people may argue that this makes good sense, that these horrendous costs are justified by the end result. This is an argument that Madeleine Albright made in a famous conversation with Leslie Stahl of CBS. Leslie Stahl said to her, do you know that 500,000 children have died in Iraq as a result of US sanctions? This was in 1996. And Leslie Stahl asked Madeleine Albright if she thought that was justified. And Madeleine Albright shockingly said that she thought it was the right thing to do, to, in effect, murder 500,000 Iraqi children for the purposes of crusading. Of course, it didn't work out that way, and what happened is that we had to invade Iraq, as you all remember, in 2003. The sanctions didn't work. This brings us to the whole question of the consequences of these acts where we crusade around the world, the consequences of regime change. Just to start, we have a rich literature in academia which shows that when you knock off regimes and you try to promote democracy, it fails almost every time. The only case since World War II where we succeeded in regime change was in Panama in 1989. This means we have not succeeded in producing a regime change that led to a democracy since the Cold War ended, since 9/11. This is a policy that fails almost every time. If you have any doubts about that, think about Afghanistan. We knocked off the Taliban. Who's in control in Afghanistan now? The Taliban. Think about Iraq, one of the greatest foreign policy disasters in American history. We went in there in 2003. Obama took us out in 2011. We had to go back in 2014 to deal with ISIS, and we're still there. And then there's Iran. I believe that Iran will eventually be proven to be the most disastrous foreign policy decision in American military history. So if you look at Afghanistan, you look at Iraq, and you look at Iran, you see, as the academic literature says, that regime change does not work. It's remarkably difficult to promote democracy at the end of a rifle barrel. One final point. One might think that crusaders are in favor of promoting democracy, period. But that's not true. Crusaders distinguish between like-minded democracies, this is a phrase that Mike often uses, and other democracies. And Mike is interested in producing a world with like-minded democracies. And of course, the end result of this is that we go around the world and we knock off democracies that we do not consider to be like-minded. So you should remember as we go through this debate tonight that the United States has a rich history of knocking off democracies that are not like-minded around the world. Iran, 53, Guatemala, 54, Chile, 73. I could go on and on. We have a rich history of knocking off democracies. These are not like-minded democracies. These are, in effect, monster democracies. So what we have here, the bottom line, is we have a situation where the United States tries to promote like-minded democracies and fails. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, audience, for keeping our debaters on time and on their toes. Our last opening statement goes to Victoria Nuland.
Well, thank you, Munk team, for the opportunity to join this great audience and my colleagues here on the stage for an important conversation. Let me start where Secretary Pompeo finished. Neither the United States, nor Canada, nor any of the great democracies can afford to cede the world to monsters or allow them to upend the global order that has benefited free nations for 80 years. Mike and I believe, as he said, that the U.S. and our allies are far better protected by confronting those monsters before they grow powerful enough to threaten us at home or to destroy the foundations of the world that we have built. But as you've heard, our opponents have a different view. They called it offshore balancing, a realist grand strategy, in a piece that they co-authored in 2016. And here's the key tenet of that strategy, and I quote, "If there is no potential hegemon in sight in Europe, in North Asia, or in the Gulf, then there's no reason to deploy ground or air forces there, and little reason for a large military establishment at home." As the great crooner Sam Cooke would say, ladies and gentlemen, what a wonderful world that would be, right? But it's not our world. From Putin's 4 years of vicious war against Ukraine, to China's coercion of Taiwan and its neighbors, to Iran's refusal to give up its nuclear weapons capability and its dominance now of the Straits of Hormuz, the dangers, the monsters seeking to dominate Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Gulf are growing stronger. The professor suggests that the U.S. turn to regional forces as the first line of defense. If those powers cannot contain a potential hegemon on their own, however, the U.S. must help get the job done. Thank you both for that. That's precisely where we are now on all three continents, and it's been that way for most of the last 80 years. Our allies need our help keeping monsters at bay. Maybe each could do more, but we are not, sadly, professors, in your wonderful world. We should have learned that lesson in the last bloody century. As long as humans roam the earth, monsters will emerge among us. In the 1930s, we offshore balanced our way into letting Hitler almost take over Europe, and the Japanese imperial forces almost dominate Asia. But when Americans, Canadians, and free nations everywhere joined forces to vanquish those monsters and then built institutions like NATO, the EU, and the UN, we ushered in the longest period of security and prosperity the world has ever known. But as Mike has said, hunting doesn't necessarily mean going to war or regime change, as they're trying to accuse us of. As a career diplomat, I will always choose diplomacy first, but it's got to be backed by power to deter, to contain, to constrain the monster, to dig a ditch that he falls into, if we can't reach a settlement that neutralizes him or keeps him in his lair. War must be the last resort, but history shows some monsters will not stop until they're vanquished. As practitioners, Mike and I also know that each monster is different. Each requires a different set of tools, ranging from inducements to negotiations, to deterrence, to political and economic pressure, and combinations of those. As strong nations, we have a full toolkit, but locking away those tools or watching from the sidelines is not the right answer. Nor will Mike and I argue that the U.S. has always deployed its tools right, or in the right way, or gotten the right outcome. But not acting is often more dangerous, waiting not just for the monster to appear at our door, but for it to get into the house. I personally remember vividly a time when we did not act, and paid dearly for it. During countless conversations that I witnessed in Moscow in the 1990s, including with Putin, senior Russians warned us about the growth of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and its potential threat to the United States. U.S. intelligence didn't take it seriously. How could some dudes hiding in caves actually threaten us? The Russians must be trying to trick us out of our offshore armchair, carefully balanced. We learned our lesson on September 11th. Inaction, inattention to the monsters in our midst can often be more costly than the mistakes we inevitably make during a complex monster hunt. Here's another thing. Mike and I will not always agree with each other on every aspect of every monster hunting expedition. Tonight, you'll hear Secretary Pompeo support our current course of action in Iran, and you'll hear me oppose the war and argue that we could have and still should do much more with economic tools, support for the democratic opposition, and forceful negotiations. But we both agree Iran must never have a nuclear weapon, and under the mullahs and the IRGC, it poses an unacceptable risk to the region, to the freedom of navigation, to the US, to Canada, and to global peace and security. We have to pressure this regime until it stops its monstrous behavior or it falls. We're going to talk about all these things tonight, but here's the bottom line. We enjoy the peace and prosperity and security we have today as democracies because we hunt the monsters before they take over. I can't speak for Mearsheimer and Walt, but Secretary Pompeo and I don't want to live in their monster world, and nor should you. Thank you.
Let's thank these debaters for 4 fantastic opening statements. We have a great debate on our hands. Okay, now one of my favorite parts of every Munk debate, we have rebuttals. 3 minutes each. We're going to go the same speaking order as the opening statements. Stephen Waltz, you're up first.
Okay, so first off, what is the definition of a monster here? Iraq, for example, was a country we supported in the 1980s to balance Iran, and then we decided that Saddam was a monster. So I'm curious as to what the definition is. And as John pointed out, we sometimes think that freely elected democracies are sufficiently monstrous, we have to overthrow them as well. Second, if you listen carefully to what was said, they're basically calling for preventive wars. Don't let the monsters gather strength. In other words, it's our responsibility, our right, to go out and start wars, a violation of the UN Charter, when we've concluded ourselves that some country is sufficiently dangerous that we need to take it out. Ask yourself, do you trust America's judgment to always make the right call there? Then Victoria has quoted an article of ours, but she's like one of my students who doesn't get to the end of the article and actually read the whole thing. If you go to that article and you read the whole thing, you'll discover that we actually call for an active efforts to balance China, because China is an emerging peer competitor. We're not against the use of force. We're not against organizing alliances to deal with serious challenges, including emerging threats. That's what offshore balancing is all about. When you see a potential regional hegemon emerging, as China is, you have to organize a coalition to deal with it. And then finally, consider what the policies they've been supporting have done for us. We've weakened our ability to deal with a challenger like China. China isn't starting wars. China's building power at home. China is building influence around the world. China is starting to dominate technologies, while the United States spends trillions of dollars in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, and now, of course, in Iran, right? So ask yourself, who's falling into a ditch? It's us. Who's falling into a quagmire? It's us, because we are seeking out monsters, including monsters that may not even exist, and losing sight of what the real challenges we face are. I'll stop there.
Okay. Mike Pompeo, your rebuttal, please.
Well, just to respond to that for a second, you said China's not starting wars. They've started 11 wars. During my time, they invaded India, right? They came to the Himalayas and killed Indians. They've surrounded Philippine ships. They've gone around Vietnamese oil rigs offshore. Those are kinetic war actions by a monster. And so to say they haven't started wars belies the reality of this. So that's important. Second, you guys keep throwing around the word crusader. That's fun. And you said I don't knock off like democracies. But just for the record, as the Secretary of State, we didn't knock off a single nation. We didn't start a single war. We deterred our adversaries for 4 years. Not once did we face that. And I don't even, when you say we're knocking off like-minded democracies, you cited things from like the 1800s. You weren't too recent. You didn't catch Al-Qaeda. Is that like-minded democracy? You said the Taliban's still in charge. Yeah, that's partly true, but they're weaker. They're not exporting terror in the same way they were on the streets of Canada, in the streets of Europe, in the United States. We were very effective at countering terrorism there. And then lastly, because I've just got a minute here, you said there's costs associated with this. Isn't that the truth? It's so damn true. And that's important. But the benefits, ladies and gentlemen, to you from the hard work and those costs are staggering. And I say the same thing to my Republican friends who end up in a different place. They end up working for the Quincy Institute like y'all. You know, it's one thing to talk about international relations theory, and it's another thing to live in a real world where there are indeed monsters. And you talked about China. You said, well, we should gather coalitions. Thank you. That's hunting, right? That's what I'm speaking to. Not every hunt involves kinetic force. Building coalitions to push back, not against a peer competitor, as you described China, but a man intent on global hegemony, a true monster, Xi Jinping. Building out that coalition is part of the hunt. This is the way one does it. One doesn't always. Sometimes one sets a trap. Sometimes one builds a wall. There are many ways to keep places safe and to protect nations from monsters. There are so many tools in our arsenal. We ought to use them effectively. But I want to come back to this cost. The benefits of that work, the benefits of American leadership on a global basis have been staggeringly good for the American people. We have the most robust economy in the world. What happened in the market today? You all talk about the Iran war as a cataclysm. Boy, it was really something, huh? Right? Good things are happening in the world. And, you know, energy prices are high. That's not good. I get it. But boy, when we finally, in the end, ensure that Iran is 25, 50 years from a nuclear weapon, your children and grandchildren will be far safer. And the cost to the American people will be real, but the benefits enormous.
Okay, great arguments all around. John Mearsheimer, we're going to put 3 minutes on the clock. Let's have your rebuttal.
It's very important to understand that we recognize that there are monsters in the world, like Nazi Germany, Imperial Germany, the Soviet Union. And as Steve made clear, a rising China is a potential threat to the United States, and we're in favor of containing it. We're realists, so we believe that military force is an important instrument in the conduct of foreign policy. There's just no question about that. We supported containment during the Cold War. We obviously think it was smart for the United States to defeat both Nazi Germany, Imperial Germany, and Imperial Japan in World War II. That's not the issue here. That's not what John Quincy Adams was talking about. John Quincy Adams was talking about going around the world and slaying monsters, and he meant countries that didn't look like the United States, countries that didn't have enough liberty, equality, justice, or enough democracy. And the argument is that those countries are seen by many Americans as monsters. And what we should do is go to those countries, topple the regimes, and make them look like the United States. That's the issue on the table tonight. This is all about social engineering in what we used to call the developing world. This is not about containing other great powers or dealing with Nazi Germany. We obviously agree you have to deal with those monsters. And the argument that we're making is that many of these states that we go after, like Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan, do not present a serious threat to us. Moreover, if you get into the business of doing social engineering in those countries, what happens is that you end up paying enormous costs, and the consequences are oftentimes, almost always, in fact, disastrous. And if you look at what's happening in Iran today, and by the way, Iran was not a meaningful threat to the United States. The idea that Iran was on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons or even on the road to acquiring nuclear weapons is simply a false argument. Regardless, we went in there and we created a disastrous situation. The United States has lost this war. It can't figure out how to solve this war, and it's going to have enormously negative consequences for all of you. You should understand that. We are in deep trouble in Iran. And this is what happens when you go around the world slaying monsters.
Okay. Some great rebuttals here. Victoria Nuland, you get the last word in the rebuttal section of tonight's debate.
So these guys would have a great set of arguments if the prompt in this debate was should the U.S. be involved in regime change, or should the U.S. go around the world overthrowing governments? That is not what we're arguing here today. What we are arguing is whether the U.S., Canada, surrounded by our allies, should take on those nations, those entities that are seeking to change the rules of the road that have favored freedom for some 80 years. And should we use all of the tools that we have? They're trying to characterize us as warmongers. That is not what we are saying here. We are saying that you cannot wait for this monster. You need to create a situation that contains it or deters. And when they change the prompt, because they basically agree with us on that, then it's much easier to argue with us. Look, as I said at the beginning, there are many ways to take on Iran, but there's a reason why 3 American presidents in a row, maybe 4, have worked hard to ensure that Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon. And there are many ways to do this. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to support the military choice that we've made now, but nonetheless, we have sitting here in Professor Mearsheimer somebody who said just 10 years ago that it would actually be probably a stabilizing thing if Iran had a nuclear weapon. Well, great. Iran gets a nuclear weapon, then who's going to be next? It's going to be Israel, it's going to be Saudi Arabia, Germany. Thank you all for your support here. So, that's what we're talking about here. We talk about Saddam Hussein, that he wasn't a threat in the 80s. No, he wasn't a threat in the 80s, unless you were Iran, obviously. But we had years and years and years of Saddam Hussein not complying with UN resolution after UN resolution requiring inspection to prove that he didn't have chemical weapons, biological weapons, and he chose not to do that. So the world did not know what kind of threat he was. I am not going to sit here and justify all of the ways that the Iraq War went forward, but nonetheless, it is counterfactual to say that the world would have been better off if we'd left Saddam Hussein in place. We've now had 6 democratic elections in Iraq, and it is not a threat to its neighbors. Nor is Afghanistan a threat to us or its neighbors, and it would be if al-Qaeda continued to rule there. So, this is not a matter of whether you start wars. This is a matter of whether, as democratic nations, we need to push to keep countries obeying the rule of law.
Okay, everybody, great rebuttals. I'm going to join the conversation now, pepper you guys with some questions, get this debate moving along. And I think I've got to start with the topic, obviously, that's dominating our newsfeed hour by hour, and that is the Iran war. So, Mike Pompeo, let me come to you first. You were an early and vocal supporter of this war. Why is it not Exhibit A for your opponents tonight in this debate?
Well, I'm not a supporter of the war in the sense of, they killed a lot of us. This is right. I never am in favor of war, but when one is faced with a murderous regime that sponsored the folks who killed thousands of people in Israel on October 7th of 2023, who still continues to support Hezbollah today, who, by the way, has a fatwa on my head as we sit here tonight. Thank you, security team. By the way, it's about $1 million. My wife thinks it's a little low, but no, this is a regime that, John said that Iran wasn't a threat to the United States. Ask the husbands or the wives of those who were killed by Qasem Soleimani, who was doing nothing more. Those people were doing nothing more than trying to take down terrorism in the Middle East. And he killed 500 of them. The Iranian regime presented an enormous threat to Western civilization. They're sponsored by the Russians and the Chinese, and they had a fundamentally different view of what the world should look like, right? They think the world should look something like a place without basic human dignity, without property rights, without even any sense of decency, and they were expropriating that. That is, it was an external push. This wasn't about changing a regime in Iran for internal purposes. This was about protecting Europe and Canada and the United States of America. And I do support what President Trump has done so far. Indeed, I wish he had continued this. Because in the end, I remind myself, if in the president's first term, he had taken the action he has taken this term, there wouldn't have been a single Shahed drone land in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. They didn't have any. There wouldn't have been a single long-range missile capable of reaching Diego Garcia and Europe, because at that point, they did not have any. But of course, we didn't do it in the first term, and President Biden chose not to either. President Trump finally said, they continue to be murderous monsters, and we're going to make sure we take this on now, because it will get more difficult. They will ultimately deliver a nuclear capability, and we're not going to put America at risk from that.
Okay. I think we all appreciate that forthright defense. Let me come to the other side here. Stephen, I'll go to you first. Let's talk about this point. I mean, Iran was enriching uranium to levels that had no civilian justification. It attacked through its proxies Israel over years. It murdered Canadian and American citizens around the world through the spread of global terrorism. You put that all together, and if we really want to be honest with ourselves, should we be grateful that the United States finally acted?
No. First of all, think of where the situation was 3 or 4 months ago, right? The Strait of Hormuz was open. Oil and gas were at $60 a barrel. Iran was led by an aging, unpopular regime, right? The United States had full weapons stockpiles. It hadn't had to pull weapons out of East Asia, places like that. Where are we today, right? Iran has a more radical regime. The regime hasn't been toppled, right? Oil, last time I checked, was well over $100 a barrel. And this is going to have long-term consequences. Fertilizer isn't getting out of the Gulf either, which is going to have long-term consequences on food prices, and people are going to starve around the world as a result of that. And Iran has now learned that it can weaponize closing the Strait of Hormuz. So no, this was not the right way to deal with it. And back, by the way, before Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State, we had a nuclear agreement with Iran where they had agreed to the strictest inspections in world history. They were permitted to have 300 kilograms of enriched uranium. That's how much they had, and it was enriched to 3.6%. After they tore up the deal, a deal, by the way, part of the rules-based order that was fully endorsed by a unanimous vote of the UN Security Council. Mike walked away from that.
Do you think they were?
Wait,
just for a second.
This is my turn, sir.
No, well, wrap up, because Mike wants in here, and this is a debate.
When we started the war back in June 2025, when Israel and the United States attacked Iran, they had over 10,000 kilograms of enriched uranium, some of it enriched as much as 60%. So the decision to leave the JCPOA was a huge strategic blunder, and it's one of the reasons we are in a war today.
Okay, Stephen, I want to give Mike a quick rebuttal, because
only this.
His time.
Only this. I'm familiar with Brooklyn and bridges and the like. And if you think the Iranians were complying with the JCPOA, I got one for you.
This is what the IAEA said.
Yeah.
You like a rules-based order, then you have to listen to objective international organizations.
What the IAEA said is what.
Let me come to Victoria now.
For the record, what the IAEA said is, to the best we can tell, and let me assure the audience that when the Israelis took out the documents hidden inside of Iran about their nuclear program, work was still underway.
Yeah. Victoria, let me come to you. You're not a supporter of kinetic action against Iran, but you've indicated that it was simply unacceptable for the world to allow Iran to enrich uranium to levels that could quickly facilitate the construction of an atomic weapon. Give us the argument of why an aggressive posture towards Iran was necessary, maybe in your case short of military force, but aggressive nonetheless.
Listen, I also wasn't a supporter of ripping up the JCPOA. It was far from perfect, but what we could have done was build upon it, both to continue its length and also to deal with what we now see is equally dangerous, which is, well, maybe not equally, but the long-range missile strike capability, et cetera, their support for terrorism. In the Biden administration, we spent 4 years trying to get Iran to come back to the table in a serious way, either at the level of the JCPOA or even better, and they would not play. Okay. And we gave them every opportunity to do that. And so, Look, I am glad that we buried a huge amount of that nuclear material in June. Do I think now that with the Iranian people rising up, we could have done overtly and covertly more support for them? Do I think that the sanctions regime, President Trump is a fan of maximum pressure. I don't think in his first year of his second term, he applied maximum pressure on their economy and those kinds of things, and we should have tried all of those things first. We were at the negotiating table. We also, had, yes, an aging leader, and now we have a tougher group of younger guys who have to prove themselves. Yeah. So.
Okay, Victoria. John, to come to you, the counterexample of inaction vis-a-vis Iran is North Korea. It's nuclear armed, it's belligerent, it is now protected by its own nuclear umbrella. Why, give me the argument for why North Korea wasn't, in a sense, a foreign policy failure, a failure on part of the United States and the world to confront a power at a moment when we could have, like we're confronting Iran now, as opposed to letting North Korea jump forward to a bomb and become the rogue nation that it is today?
Well, it was a foreign policy failure in the sense that North Korea got nuclear weapons. Yeah. We tried to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons, and they got them. And it's very important to understand here that states have powerful incentives to get nuclear weapons. You all understand that the United States has nuclear weapons, and it has no intention of getting rid of its nuclear weapons because we understand they are the ultimate deterrent. And the same logic applies to North Korea. And we tried, and I believe that we were somewhat disingenuous in our dealings with the North Koreans, didn't deliver on all the promises, and the end result is they went out and got nuclear weapons. But the question is, what should we have done to prevent that? The last time we went into North Korea was in 1950 when we crossed the 38th parallel heading towards the Yalu River. The end result is that the Chinese came in and we ended up fighting the Chinese in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. There was no way we could invade North Korea and prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons, which is why we had to sit by and watch it happen. And the point I tried to make about Iran is that if you go into a country like Iran with good intentions, the end result is you're going to create a disaster. And that's actually what's happened. We are in a losing war. And if anything, we've given the Iranians greater incentives than ever to acquire nuclear weapons. If you're the Iranians, you look at the North Koreans and you say to yourself, the North Koreans got this one right. We were foolish not to develop nuclear weapons on our own earlier because they make such good sense.
Mike, let's hear some applause for John's answer. But Mike, let me come to you and talk a little bit more about Iran in the Straits of Hormuz, because it's emerged as the fulcrum point, which now these on and off negotiations seem to be spiraling around. And needless to say, it has big global consequences. I don't know if anybody in the audience has filled their car up with gas in the last 2 weeks. Rather painful. So, Mike, you're Secretary of State, former head of the CIA. Boy, this really looks like an intractable problem that has been created. Do you see a solution to the Straits of Hormuz?
Well, first of all, let's go back to what we're debating tonight. I've not heard my opponents say Iran is a monster. I think this is irrefutable. The deaths, the ability to export terror around the world, not only the ability, the capacity, you and I both, right? We both studied at West Point. It's about capability and intent, right? That's what you learned in your military history 101. They had the capability to export terror, and they had the intention of doing so. You need only look at the press releases. And you all somehow suggest that it's worse today, as if there's such a thing as an Iranian moderate. Like, oh my gosh, they're so much worse today. And geez, if they'd have just known that North Korea had a nuclear weapon, they would have done, like, they know. Trust me. Now, these are radicals. These are monsters. And so now the task at hand is not costless and not easy. Make no mistake about it. I do not make light about the risk. We've already had Americans killed in the course of this conflict, and it breaks my heart that these folks sacrifice. But they sacrifice for an important objective: straightening out the straits, creating freedom of navigation so this product can indeed move. And you suggested somehow that, oh, now the Iranians know they can use this as a tool. Come on, folks. They built up this entire arsenal with the sole mission of having this as leverage that they have been using against the world for decades. One of the reasons President Biden didn't do what President Trump did, and President Obama didn't do it, and President Trump didn't do it in his first term, because he knew precisely what they would do. They would use the tools that they'd built to close the strait. This is not news. If you think this is new, I mean, that's crazy, right? Somehow you suggested, like, oh my gosh, they finally decided, hey, you know what we could do? Like, no, the truth of the matter is he has to go finish this task. And what does finishing it look like? We can actually do the hard work with our Gulf Arab allies, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis, our friends in Israel. We can collectively, and I hope the Europeans, and I'd love to see the Canadians join us too, to do what humanity demands, right? This is what human decency demands. You don't let a radical regime close off the global economy by firing Shaheed missiles into nations that did nothing, right? They're firing into civilians in the United Arab Emirates even just this week. That's just not something that the world can accept. And so this monster is worthy of the hunt.
You do know, Mike, that we started the war.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Oh, no. Stephen.
They weren't firing those missiles until Israel and the United States attacked Iran. You do understand that, right?
Welcome to 1979, when the revolutionary regime began to kill Europeans.
You do know that we overthrew the democratically elected government in 1954.
Just for the record, you were talking about this.
You don't think Iran you think Iran's forgotten about that?
No, I suspect they've not.
You don't think Iran remembers that we supported Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War?
I know
forgotten
this.
about this?
I know this.
Other countries have history.
Do you think Iran is a monster?
No.
Okay.
Okay, there
I
you
don't
go.
think there's. I don't think there's.
Okay.
I'm glad I don't
There you
live
go.
there. I think many countries do many bad things, including my own, and I wouldn't call the United States a monster.
But Stephen,
do also remember that we wouldn't have had October 7th if we hadn't had Iranian support for Hamas.
I agree. We wouldn't have had October 7th if we'd gotten peace in the Middle East, and that's a much longer story.
It is, and every single U.S. president has tried and will continue to.
Not very hard.
But it is very important to emphasize there's no evidence that Iran even knew about October 7th, much less caused it.
Oh my goodness. I'm sure it is lovely to live where you live and believe
there's
that.
no evidence in the public record of that.
Oh my goodness.
The other general point I would make is there's no
Mr.
question.
CIA Director, did Iran know about Hamas? Did Iran fund Hamas? Did Iran make Hamas possible?
It's unworthy of response.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's that straightforward.
I have yet to see any evidence that Iran even knew about October 7th.
This is the world they live in, ladies and gentlemen.
And I've looked very hard.
They don't have to do it, they just get to teach it.
Mike, you have...
I just want to say on your point about...
Sorry, hold on a second. The Munk Debates is about civility and substance, and if you're yelling in the hall, sir, you're out of here, okay? So I'm instructing the security in the hall that if that gentleman decides to try to interrupt this debate, eject him. He's gone. Sorry. John, go ahead.
Mike made the point that the Iranians have killed lots of people outside of their borders. Just a couple points here. One, Iran has not invaded or attacked another country since it became a modern state in 1935. Furthermore, if you talk about how many people the United States has killed around the world in recent decades compared to the Iranians, as the numbers I put out before show very clearly, the United States has killed far more people than the Iranians have killed.
Okay, let's move on and court a little more controversy. So, Stephen, I'm going to come to you. This debate's turning out really well.
Having fun, right?
Stephen, nearly 20 years ago, you and John co-wrote a then controversial book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. Again, we're going to ask security to remove this gentleman. We're sorry that he's disturbing our debate.
I'm not sure who he's mad at.
Sir, there is a live stream. Suggest maybe find a quiet place. monkdebates.com/live stream. Yell at your screen all night long. Go knock yourself out.
It feels a little un-Canadian,
It
right?
does, it
yeah,
does.
Just really...
You wrote a controversial book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. Your argument was that an organized pro-Israeli coalition disproportionately influences U.S. politics and in turn subverts the national interest abroad. Connect this thesis to the latest war in Iran today.
Well, I think it's well known, a matter of the public record, that Trump's decision to go along with Israel's desire for another war with Iran was heavily influenced by a long briefing he got from Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House, and that this was one of the key things that tipped his hand to decide for it, in part because he was convinced by this briefing that the Iranian government was fragile, would collapse overnight. This would be a quick war, last 2 or 3 days, which is what he apparently told some of our partners in the Middle East as well. So Israel certainly played a key role. And remember, Israel is fighting the war, or has fought the war along with the United States. I think also if you look at some of the people surrounding Trump, they are also very strongly pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, and they have been an influence. Witkoff, Kushner, and others, Marco Rubio in particular. So this is clearly a war that the United States is fighting very much on behalf of Israel, and it's not in Israel's interest ultimately. It's not in our interest, and it's not in the world's interest. I'll leave it there. There is the other interesting question, though. If you think about countries that are bombing their neighbors around the Middle East, right, including bombing Qatar, an American ally, that would be Israel. And yet somehow we don't think of Israel's behavior as being somehow monstrous, even though it has done certain things in recent years, such as the genocide in Gaza, that I would consider rather monstrous. So again, it gets back to the question of how are we going to define a monster here, and why are we reserving the right to know which is a monster deserving sanction and which is a country that doesn't? Okay.
Victoria, you have worked at the highest levels of U.S. statecraft in the Department of State. Is there an Israel lobby?
And does it have the eye bags to prove it?
And
yes.
does it have a disproportionate influence over U.S. foreign policy?
Look, I think we have forgotten that we're talking about monsters, and there's no country that is more of an existential monster vis-a-vis Israeli security than Iran, and has proven that again and again and again. We are not in range of Iranian missiles right now or Iranian nukes, but Israel is. I want to go back to the fact that these guys really don't see monsters anywhere. And in fact, with the exception of Iran, they should be very happy guys right now, frankly, with Trump's foreign policy. Because going back to that 2016 piece, which frankly, not only did I read to the end, but I teach my students because I want them to have a realist perspective, understand the realist perspective, and understand both the big flaws in it. But think about this. These guys have recommended that we stay home in our own hemisphere. You now have a Trump national security strategy that focuses only on the Western Hemisphere. You have a U.S. that is withdrawing forces and capabilities from Europe, that is not supporting Ukraine in the way we used to, that is moving aircraft carriers out of Northeast Asia and taking out missile defenses, that's withholding weapons from Taiwan. So they should be thrilled because we are implementing now exactly the policy that they recommended, and let's see if the world ends up safer for it.
John, that's a great answer. Are you thrilled? And do you think that the Israel lobby has a disproportionate influence over U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I just want to say to Toria that we are not advocating that the United States should stay home in the Western Hemisphere. We supported containment against the Soviet Union. We supported the first Gulf War in 1991. We argue that the United States should contain China. I'm fully in favor of giving weapons to Taiwan. And I'm actually one of the few realists who says that I would defend Taiwan if Taiwan was attacked by China.
Good.
So the idea that we're sort of...
I'll tell my students that when we teach the piece.
It's in the article.
but no.
In the fine print.
No, to be clear here, the idea that we're shrinking violets, right, who don't believe that the world is a dangerous place and that military force doesn't matter, is simply wrong. We are realists, and by the way, we pay a certain price in academia for that, as you can easily imagine, I'm sure. But I just want to talk about Iran as an existential threat to Israel. I do understand that Israel views Iran as an existential threat, but it's very important to understand that Iran views Israel as an existential threat. And it was Israel that attacked Iran last June, and then the United States came in. And on February 28th of this year, it was Israel and the United States that attacked Iran. And as Steve pointed out, the United States overthrew the Mossadegh government in Iran in 1953. We supported Saddam to include helping him acquire chemical weapons, i.e. weapons of mass destruction, to use against Iran in the Iraq-Iran war. 250,000 Iranians died in that war, an enormous number of people. So I'm just saying to you, you have to be able to put yourself in the feet or in the shoes of the Iranians and understand that from their point of view, Israel is an existential threat. And what I find most amazing, to be honest, is that Iran didn't go out and get nuclear weapons because, as Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, said, it just makes so much sense from their point of view because Israel and the United States are an existential threat to Iran.
Again, we spent 4 years in the Biden administration trying to get Iran to come to the table in a serious way. On the table was having nuclear power, but not nuclear weapons. On the table was relief of sanctions if they would do that, if they would stop their support for terror, including Hamas and including Hezbollah in Lebanon, including the Houthis in the Red Sea. And we got nowhere. And I think Israel got worried about waiting.
Well, if Mike hadn't walked away from the JCPOA, you wouldn't have had to spend all that time getting back into it.
Let's bring
The
Mike in.
JCPOA ended in 24. It was going to need extending anyway.
That's actually a good point. If we hadn't walked away from JCPOA today, they would be free to have nuclear weapons.
Right. It would have ended. It needed to be extended anyway.
And no one could, including the best efforts of Toria, couldn't negotiate because the Iranians said no. So there was an effort to make it better, but the Iranians wanted none of it. Your point, you said you're surprised they didn't have a nuclear weapon. I'm not. They were trying desperately to get a nuclear weapon, slowly, surely, determinedly, and progressing. And the reason they didn't get them is because there was a lot of work done by a lot of really talented, risk-taking people to slow down that program over an awfully long time. Not any one administration, multiple times, and not just America. Great partners. The Canadian Intelligence Service were great partners of mine when I was the CIA director. And so, I'm not surprised. Second, I can't let go. You said Israel committed genocide. Sir, that in my judgment is indecent. It's also factually wrong. And there's a very simple definition of genocide. I declared it once against the Chinese government for enslaving Uyghur Muslims in China. This was seconded by Secretary Blinken, continuing America's position that that was genocide. What the Israelis have done is pure self-defense. And we can argue about some, we can always argue about tactics and decisions. You mentioned Abu Ghraib, that's a disgrace. And we punished the soldiers that did that, and properly so. Mistakes get made, I get that. And the Israelis may well have made some too. I am confident that their military system will respond to that. But the intention here was very clear. And to say that Israel was an existential threat to Iran, I see no evidence in the record of such a thing. Were the Iranians to take their proxy forces from the field, Israel would live its life as the proper Jewish homeland. I'm convinced of that. And then finally, it's worth thinking about this as we talk about monsters. One of these gentlemen said that not only should we not have gone after Assad in Syria, but we should have supported him. He too was killing Americans. He too was sponsoring terrorism in the region and around the world. There's not a Gulf Arab leader that believed Assad was actually the right answer for them. He was an evil monster. Not only did he kill hundreds of thousands of his own, you all would say, that's their problem. That's internal. We ought not even think about that. Woe be it unto us to protect human dignity and decency around the world. You would say, no, 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 we must be restrained. Fair enough. But that wasn't the limit of Assad's effort. And so to suggest that we should somehow have supported that monster, I think suggests to you only this. There is no monster that they're actually prepared to hunt. And we could argue about which monsters are which, but I've not yet said, no, that's a monster today on the world stage. Not Al-Qaeda, not ISIS, not Vladimir Putin, not Chairman Kim in North Korea, not Xi Jinping, not Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. There's not a monster today that is roaming the earth that you all believe is worthy of an effort to hunt. And I think that puts Canadians at an awful lot of risk if we went down that path.
Given Mike's list of monsters, we're going to spend the next 2 centuries running around the world trying to promote regime change here, there, and everywhere.
I'm not suggesting
and I
any
can
of that.
guarantee you that's not going to have a happy ending.
I'm not suggesting regime change any of those places.
But I want to say just a word on the whole subject of genocide in Gaza. The 3 leading human rights groups in the world, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which is a very fine Israeli human rights group, have all done lengthy reports. Yeah. These are thick reports, well documented, that all make the case that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Furthermore, there are a number of Israeli scholars of genocide and the Holocaust who have declared that what is going on in Gaza is a genocide. So I think it is clearly a genocide, and I think not only is Israel committing this, but the United States is complicit in that genocide.
Let me bring Stephen in. He's looking for my eye.
Well, and by the way, if you want to argue about that word, well, fine, we'll drop the word. Let's just call it mass killing of civilians. Right? Call it mass killing of civilians. That's still a monstrous act. And it was done, bankrolled with American weapons. So something we should have done something to stop, which we didn't.
But Stephen, to come to Mike's pointed question, identify a monster out there right now. Do you have one on your list that you feel would warrant U.S. action, U.S. forward projection of economic, military, diplomatic, and other force to try to actively constrain, change, remove from the stage a monster? Is there one that reaches a standard for you?
Or simply deter. I mean, don't let them caricature us as having to overthrow everybody. Deterrence is equally effective when it works.
Fine.
Or negotiations.
In the article that John and I wrote that Victoria has to get to the end too soon, we explicitly call for the United States. Explicitly call for the United States to be using the power at its disposal to balance China in Asia, because it's a peer competitor, right? And that means forging alliances, strengthening the alliances that we have in Asia, maintaining military forces, focusing our energies at home in key areas of technology so we can compete more effectively with China, not doing most of the things that we've been doing, and certainly not squandering time, attention, and resources on peripheral conflicts like the Middle East, which is the best thing we could possibly have done for China, right? Xi Jinping must be delighted, as The Economist magazine put on its cover a couple of months ago, looking at with a picture of Xi Jinping, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake, right? China's not starting wars with lots of other countries. The stuff that Mike mentioned is minor league stuff compared to what we've been doing. Imagine what the United States could have done with the $6 to $8 trillion we spent on Iraq and Afghanistan. $6 to $8 trillion. That's an awful lot of research and development. That's an awful lot of weaponry. that could have been devoted to building up our strength in Asia. So you want me to counter a monster there? I'd like to deter China from dominating Asia, and one of the ways I want to do that is by not running around searching for lots of other monsters to destroy.
Yeah. Victoria, I want you to respond to that, but Russia and Ukraine is not on Stephen's list, but it would be on yours.
It certainly would. But let me first respond on China, and then we can come back on Russia.
I want to get to Russia and Ukraine.
We've got a whole 12 minutes here. Thank you, Stephen. I'm really glad that you recognize the challenge that we have from China, because until May 12th of this year, you were pretty confident that we were balancing China just fine. In fact, in 23 and again in 25, you said that it was not a regional hegemon. And on May 12th, you wrote in Foreign Policy magazine, oh my gosh, could China become a regional hegemon? So this is the problem. If you don't recognize the monster until it's breathing on you, it can often be too late and too difficult. So look, I agree with you that this administration needs to be doing more vis-a-vis China, and we didn't do enough in that summit, and we're not using the pressure that we have, but we need to have been doing it much more consistently and strongly, and you guys should have recognized it as a monster at least 10 years ago, because Xi Jinping has changed the direction of China, and it is a threat now.
I would note to you.
We only have 11 minutes left, and we got Ukraine and Russia to deal with. So, John, you've been an outspoken critic of the war in Ukraine. Why is Vladimir Putin and this war that has killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians not on your list as one of the monstrosities on the world stage today?
Well, I think that the war in Ukraine was a preventive war. I think it was largely caused by NATO expansion into Ukraine. I know that, no, I'm being very honest with you. I know that there are lots of Canadians who don't believe that, especially Canadians who have Ukrainian heritage. But I think what happened here is that we started expanding NATO in the early 1990s, and then in April 2008, we said we were going to expand the alliance to include Ukraine, and the Russians said that that would be an existential threat, and under no circumstances was that permissible. We refused to recognize the Russian argument, and we continued to push forward to bring Ukraine into NATO. And the end result is that Putin invaded Ukraine. So I think this war was principally the fault of the United States. I don't deny for one second that Putin was responsible for actually invading Ukraine, but I do think that it was precipitated by NATO expansion.
Is Putin today a monster, both at home and in Ukraine?
No.
He is not.
No.
He is not. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. There you go. Look, you had a debate on NATO enlargement in 22. You had a debate on Ukraine in 22. I will not reprise that. These guys have actually accused me of toppling the Yanukovych regime. It's direct Russian talking points that they use when they do that. NATO, and I served there twice, including as U.S. ambassador, is a defensive alliance. It does not come for you if you don't come for it. And when we enlarge... And when we began enlarging NATO in 97, we invited the Russians into a partnership with NATO. We did it twice, including seating them around the table. And the Russians were not able to use that format as the primary security format in Europe. That is what was offered, and instead they couldn't get out of their Soviet mindset. Should we have said to all those nations in the middle, you can't be in NATO? Should we say it to Ukraine if they're a European country and they meet the standards, which they don't today, and therefore we haven't brought them into NATO? That would have created an even larger gray zone, and Putin might actually be at the elbow right now if we didn't have NATO in all of those countries. So we really have to understand who the monster is here.
Stephen, you're catching my eye?
Yeah, so my view of this is that actually, first of all, it was a preventive war, and preventive war is illegal in international law, and it was a criminal act by Russia to do this. Right? I believe that Vladimir Putin is responsible for the war, but we are not blameless, right, in the sense that we should have thought about what those consequences might be. We did not take seriously the warnings that, yes, NATO claims to be defensive, and I believe most NATO officials genuinely, sincerely believe NATO is a defensive alliance, but that's not the point. The question is, how does Russia see it, and how would any major power imagine the world's most powerful military alliance moving steadily closer into your borders? Right? We would react to that if it was happening to us. Right? That's the kind of thing that would scare Mike, and he'd want to react about it. He'd want to do something about it. Right? Remember, the United States once sent 500,000 people, 500,000 soldiers to Vietnam to try and keep Vietnam on our side, keep South Vietnam on our side. And Vietnam was 8,000 miles away from the United States. Do you think maybe, just maybe, Russia was worried about the alignment of a country right next to its border joining the world's most powerful military alliance, when that same alliance had been doing a variety of other things that Russia found inimical to its interest? Does this justify what Vladimir Putin did? Absolutely not. It's a tragedy for Ukraine, but it's a tragedy in which our fingerprints are on that too.
Mike, let's go to you.
Well, there must have been a time delay fuse on Vladimir Putin's worry about NATO on his border, because they were on his border for decades, and he didn't go after Ukraine, right? So, you know, this story somehow, this Russian propaganda that says, we were just really worried about NATO, that's never attacked a nation, right? It's never invaded. That somehow Vladimir Putin thought that. And by the way, you don't get to just think something and then go out and conduct a war, right? Gosh, I'm really worried about that. No, the truth is that Vladimir Putin did this because he's a monster. He did this because he's a monster who believes that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the last century. We know that because this is what he tells us, right? This is what he says. He's unambiguous about this. He wants us to restore the Soviet Union. And so to somehow suggest that the fact that there was someone in Brussels thinking about maybe letting Ukraine one day possibly join NATO causes him to lose 1,000 human beings a day of his own, a monstrous loss for his own nation, seems to me without foundation and pretty illogical. And then finally, somehow when I hear this argument, I think people credit the United States with enormous agency and everybody else with none. As if the only actor that matters in the world is the United States of America, and everyone is just waiting around to see what we will do. Well, the reality is that these actors act on their own. They have their own views of the world. They have their own interests in the world, and they act on them. And monsters act in a way that threatens you all, that threatens your lives, that threatens Ukrainian lives. And these monsters aren't sitting around waiting. They may well wait for an excuse or a reason that they can use to explain this away to their own people. But make no mistake about it, Vladimir Putin, the once KGB agent, now monster roaming throughout not just Ukraine, but Georgia and other parts of Europe as well, that he has flown over during this war. This is a monster who will continue to have the intention to rebuild the Russian Empire for so long as he walks this planet.
John, let me come to you and give you the last word on this topic, and then I got two quick wrap-up questions for either side.
You want me to
do you want a final word on this?
On the Ukraine business, yeah. The United States has the Monroe Doctrine, and I'm sure almost everybody in the audience knows what the Monroe Doctrine is. It says that no distant great power can come into our backyard. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets, of course, put nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, and President Kennedy said that that was categorically unacceptable. No distant military forces can come into the Western Hemisphere. This is our backyard. This is the area that is of the greatest strategic importance to us. Basically, what the Russians were saying about NATO expansion is that by going into Ukraine, you are coming into our backyard. You are threatening our security. Americans should have understood this because Americans have the Monroe Doctrine. They should understand the basic logic here. But we refuse to accept it. And the end result is that Putin launched a preventive war. What was the purpose of that preventive war? It was to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. And it's very important to understand that a mere few days after the war started, Putin sent a message to Zelensky to start negotiations. And negotiations began in Istanbul. This is the famous Istanbul negotiations between the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians on the other. Putin was not interested in conquering all of Ukraine. What he was interested in doing was preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. And if you look at what happened at the Istanbul agreements, that was the centerpiece of the debate. And it was the United States and Boris Johnson, who was then Prime Minister of Britain, who told the Ukrainians to walk away from the negotiations, and the war went on. And the end result is that Ukraine is being destroyed. It's lost, and it will lose at least a fifth of its territory, and it will end up as a dysfunctional rump state. This is a total disaster.
Hold on, John. We got Victoria, and then we're going to wrap up this section.
I have to respond to this because I was there. Okay? In 2015 and 2016, when Putin first sent his little green men in and took Crimea and was sitting on Donbass and Luhansk, then he said what he wanted to do was protect Russian speakers, Russian ethnics in eastern Ukraine. He wanted them to have the highest degree of autonomy, right? I was President Obama and Secretary Kerry's negotiator, shuttling back and forth between Ukraine and Russia. We offered the Russian Federation, Ukraine did, an arrangement in the Donbass that would have given them, states' rights like Quebec in Canada, and Putin wouldn't take it. And then when we found the war plan in 2021, we had negotiations with the Russians, and at that point, Ukraine was ready to say, we will put our aspirations for NATO on pause. And that is not what Putin wanted. He wanted a change of regime to a president in Ukraine they could control again, and sovereignty over the country. And why did they negotiate in Istanbul? Because they were losing, because the Ukrainians were pushing them back. And why did we tell the Ukrainians that the deal was a bad one in March of 22? Because what Russia had in an annex was the complete military degrading of Ukraine. There were caps on every kind of defensive weapon that they could have had, and the Ukrainian negotiators were about to be snookered into doing that. And then Putin would have come for the rest of it. So please, get your facts right.
Okay. I don't believe that.
We're going to, in a few moments, move to closing statements. But before we do, to help this audience vote tonight, which you will do again at the end of the debate, I want each side to just provide a short, succinct answer to the following question. I'm going to start with you, John and Stephen, and ask the same to Toria and Mike. Succinctly, John, what does a world of U.S. foreign policy and military restraint look like a decade from now? And why should this audience believe that it would be more prosperous, freer, and peaceful than the world that your opponents have argued for and the vision that they hold? Give this audience, in a few short sentences, that case. 10 years from now, what does your world look like?
Well, my view is that the United States has to make sure that it contains China and it prevents China from dominating Asia. That's the #1 goal. And at the same time, the United States should cease and desist from running around the world as a crusader state, as John Quincy Adams made clear, and stop toppling governments and trying to turn those states into democracies. I think this has had disastrous consequences, not only in the sense that these efforts have failed at almost every turn, but the costs for the world have been enormous. So I think if we could get out of the business of looking for monsters, countries that don't have enough liberty, equality, and justice and democracy to make us happy, and then get into the business of doing social engineering to fix that problem. If we could avoid that and just concentrate on containing China, the United States would be in much better shape.
Stephen, do you want to add a little codicil to that? The world in 2035.
If the United States followed that policy, it would also be able to begin repairing its fabric at home, which is badly worn, badly torn right now. and would also find itself suddenly becoming more popular around the world. A survey by the Alliance for Democracies a few weeks ago ranked 68 countries for what their image was around the world. Canada was number 2. Good for you. China was number 38. The United States was number 64 out of 68. If we change our foreign policy, we can improve that.
Okay, thank you. Similar question to close out this moderated middle to the other side of the debate. So Victoria, the world in 2035, it's been shaped and influenced by American involvement, by an America that's leaned into the world. Why is it safer, more prosperous, and freer than the alternative reality just presented by your debate opponents?
Well, the world will only be more safe and more free and more prosperous if the United States goes back to the historic role that we've played for 80 years, along with our allies and partners, in protecting and advancing a world that is open and secure and free for as many people as want it. And that means, first and foremost, aligning with our allies on how we manage the China challenge, on pushing back Vladimir Putin and helping Ukraine maintain its sovereignty, dealing with threats like Iran and making the Middle East safe for all of our partners there, including Israel, and promoting prosperity at home. And we have to go back to setting that example. We have to be greener and cleaner ourselves. We have to use our money wisely. But this is not, if you are not willing to deal with the monsters out in this world, then the U.S. will give up its role as the leader, and everybody else will be contesting for that space, and we're not going to like the world that we live in.
I'll try to be brief. The world is way safer when the United States of America leads on the global stage. I think that is unambiguous. And I think, contrary to what was just said, I think the world knows that. You suggested some poll. I haven't seen that about the perception of America. But I'll tell you where I think most of you are storing your wealth. It's not in the renminbi, it's in the dollar, right? And so when people vote in a little survey online to, like, a poll monkey or whatever the heck it's called, right? That is really different than deciding whether you're going to buy U.S. treasuries or you're going to store your currency in Beijing. Those are two very different. One, you've actually got risk, and the other you just get to opine. And I think that's very telling. We remain a nation that is prepared to fight monsters. When we walk away from that, those monsters, and by the way, if we have a policy of not going after monsters, woe be unto us. A stated policy that says, knock yourself out, invade Ukraine, take Europe, knock yourself out, continue to kill through Hezbollah and the Iraqi Shia militias and Hamas. You can kill as many Jews as you like. If that's the stated policy of the United States, I promise you the monsters will multiply and they will grow more powerful. And the risk to all of us in this room tonight will be far greater. No, the world 10 years from now, an America that is unprepared to do the necessary, at great cost to the United States of America, will be a place that is far more unstable, far less decent, and far less safe and secure.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, that wraps up the moderated middle of this debate. We're now going to go to closing statements, 4 minutes each. We're going to do this in the opposite order of the opening. So we're going to begin with Victoria Nuland first. And first, Victoria, I want to congratulate you on probably the best shoes that have ever graced the Munk Debate stage. Okay, can we hear it for Victoria's shoes?
And they match your socks.
I'm trying. I'm trying.
Amidst all this serious stuff, we need to.
We do.
Yeah.
4 minutes. Let's go.
I think everybody can see what happened here. That fundamentally, I believe that these guys do believe that American power, that Allied power, that Canadian power should be used to keep the world safe, free, secure, open, and to push back those who want to change the rules that have kept us safe for 80 years by force. But it's a hard position to argue, because it's far easier to say that what we're about is regime change or warmongering or crusading, etc. You have to start by understanding that not all humans are good, not all nations are good, not all leaders are good, and there are, in fact, monsters out there. And we learned our lesson in the 30s. We learned our lesson that if we do not confront them, they will come for us. And when we come to that confrontation late, it is much more expensive, much harder, and much more likely that we will have to go to war to deal with it. So that's why I worry that as these guys talk about balancing and constraining, what they're actually talking about is waiting and watching, and then later you have to come in and do so much more. And in those times where we didn't choose to confront the monster, we have paid for it. I talked about it at the beginning. We paid for it when we didn't see al-Qaeda growing. Frankly, we paid for it when we didn't see how strongly Iran was fueling Hamas, fueling Hezbollah, fueling the Houthis, and continuing to cheat on its nuclear agreement and getting away with it. And it results in all of these things. October 7th, what's happening in Lebanon, all of these kinds of things. So I am a preventive diplomat. I want the United States, with Canada, with our allies, out there shaping a free and open world and making the world inhospitable for autocrats, for monsters, for those who don't believe in the UN Charter, who think you can just bite off a piece of another country and get away with it. That's not a world that I want to live in. I am proud of having worn America's T-shirt for 35 years trying to push back against monsters with all of the tools. And I don't believe the United States has been infallible, far from it, not in my lifetime, and certainly not in some of these historic examples that these guys bring up from well before even I was born, right? But if we don't do it together, Americans and Canadians, our kids are not going to live in a world that is as secure and free and open as we have enjoyed. And not only that, we haven't even talked today about the fact that these monsters are working together far more than they have since the Cold War. So that's China, Russia, Iran, helping each other with technology, with weapons, with money, all of these kinds of things. We've got to break that axis, and we've got to do it in our own interest. And that's going to require better leadership than my country is displaying right now. I want to get back to that.
Thank you, Victoria, for a fantastic closing statement. John, you're up 4 minutes on the clock. The stage is yours.
If you believe in the rules-based order and the UN Charter, it's important to understand that sitting at the heart of that order is the concept of sovereignty. And sovereignty basically says that every state on the planet has the right to determine its own foreign policy and its own domestic policy. And sovereignty is a very important concept in good part because it's designed to prevent interstate conflict. It's designed to prevent one country from interfering in the politics of another country because that country's politics are supposed to be sacrosanct. So when we talk about going around the world and slaying monsters, what we're really talking about is violating the sovereignty of other countries. Basically, what crusaders like Mike and Toria believe is that the United States has the right and the responsibility to violate the sovereignty of other states when it sees fit, number one. And number two, that we have the capability, both the intellectual capability, the know-how, as well as the material capability to go into these states when we violate their sovereignty and fix the problem. And in most cases, what this means is turning those states into a democracy, to make them look like the United States. Because, of course, we're the good guys, and if we can make the bad guys look like the good guys, we all live happily ever after. Now, the problem with this is, where do you get the right to interfere in the sovereignty of other countries? Where is this written down? Where do you get the right to define who is or who is not a monster? And then come up with an argument that you or the United States has a responsibility to go in and fix this problem. That's sort of the first point. The second point is, do we really have the capability to do that? Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, and now Iran? The entire Bush doctrine. You remember when we went into Iraq in March of 2003, that was supposed to be the first stop on the train line. We were then going to knock off Syria, knock off Iran, and so forth and so on. We were going to democratize the entire Middle East. It turned out to be a disaster. The United States is not good at social engineering. I learned this as a young man during the Vietnam War when I was in the American military. The idea that you could send American GIs to South Vietnam, they could do social engineering, fix the problems in South Vietnam, and we would live happily ever after was delusional. There are real limits to what you can do with military force. So the point that I'm making to you is, number one, we don't have the right to violate the sovereignty of other states. We don't know what's good for other countries. The system was set up to let countries themselves figure out what's good for themselves, not for us to figure out what's good for them. And then furthermore, even if we could figure out what's good for them, and we thought we did have a legitimate right to go in, we would bollocks up the job in almost every case and end up killing millions of people in the process. So the best thing is to understand the limits of military force, and for the United States in the future to act with restraint.
Okay. Mike, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you. I don't even think I need 4 minutes. By the way, I think I'm the only one up here who's run for elected office before. First rule about running for elected office, you all are about to vote, Pompeo Nuland. Vote frequently, vote often, just like Chicago. Look, I'm glad you brought up sovereignty. Let's take a look at the 3 situations that are on the table today that we spoke about. Israel didn't violate Iranian sovereignty. Iran killed thousands of Israelis in the Negev, inside of Israel. Ukraine didn't violate Russian sovereignty. Right? Russia violated Ukrainian sovereignty. And then you talk about China. It is in the process of threatening to violate the sovereignty of the Taiwanese people, not Taiwan, not the other way around. So I think maybe we agree that the monsters are the sovereignty violators. Are you with me? John, Stephen, you with me? You just talked about sovereignty, right? Who went into whose country? Who invaded? We now, this is data, this is simple. The United States didn't invade any of those nations. Indeed, it is Iran that is holding an international waterway hostage, violating the sovereignty of every nation who desires to travel through the state today. And the United States is doing its level best to open that back up. Were the Iranians to allow free transit through the Strait of Hormuz, I promise you President Trump would declare that this was over. He would say, no, that's good enough. He's not, you call us crusaders. President Trump is very much willing to say, no, if you'll stop violating the sovereignty of every nation who wants free transit through the strait, we would find that conflict come to full resolution immediately. Last thought here, and this does matter. What we've been debating tonight is not whether we're going to agree on who the monsters are necessarily. We may agree or disagree from time to time. And it's not that every time we identify a monster, we should immediately go chase it. In my storyline, Tommy, for a long time, lets the monsters abuse him. But there comes a point where the monster must be hunted, and the monster must be defeated, and we must get victory. And if you ask me, the central failure of the last handful of years is that we've not been prepared to win, to allow the Ukrainians to win in Russia, to make sure that Western civilization wins against the Chinese Communist Party, that we are prepared to actually win. And by winning, I mean these monsters must stop threatening us. They can run their government however they are. We're good friends with many nations that aren't democracies. I spent a good deal of my time as Secretary of State working to build partnerships with nations that were no more democracies than a man in the moon. But they respected basic civil rights. They did their best to treat their people well. And most importantly, they weren't trying to kill people and violate other nations' sovereignty. And those were our friends, those were our partners. That's who we were working alongside. And that is the proper place for America, Canada, NATO, Western civilization to plant its flag. And when we do that, the world will be safer, the monsters will be deterred, and then the four of us can go have a beer. We're going to go have a Molson's.
Canadian beer, let's do it. Okay, in fact, we may be able to do that in the reception in 15 minutes. So, Stephen, Walt, you're going to get the last word in this debate. 4 minutes in the clock. Wrap it up for us.
Okay. So just a factual point, I think when you bomb another country and kill all of its senior leaders, you're violating its sovereignty. And the most important word that Mike used, and he used it many times tonight, was hunt. Right? He wants the United States out there hunting actively. And I'll try and pretend that occasionally that just means forming an alliance, but that's not what he's talking about. He thinks he can spot the monsters and that we have the power to deal with them, and never mind unintended consequences, never mind the possibility that you'll knock off Saddam Hussein and end up with ISIS. Right? It's this illusion of control that gets us into trouble. Now, you've just heard four Americans debate what American foreign policy should be, but I want to close by asking you to think about this as Canadians. Your country, very internationalist, actively engaged in world affairs, it's committed to diplomacy. Canadians do not go looking for trouble, but they are not afraid to go elbows up when trouble comes after them. And you enjoy a well-deserved reputation for being among the nicest people in the world. Now, I want you to imagine what would happen if, for some strange reason, your leaders decided that Canada should go out and start destroying monsters, that it should intervene in foreign countries, overthrow leaders, try to make those countries like Canada. To do that, you'd need a much larger military, and you'd need a lot more spies. You'd make a lot of new enemies, and some of those enemies would resist your efforts to convert them. So you'd have to start worrying about your security here at home, and you'd have to start keeping a closer eye on each other to make sure that sympathizers of your enemies weren't conspiring here at home. Government officials would start doing lots of things secretly, and they would start lying to you about what they were doing in various ways. Canadians would end up dying in distant lands for reasons that had nothing to do with Canadian security or Canadian prosperity. Instead of having a reputation for being nice, others around the world would start to see you as self-righteous and judgmental and impulsive in various ways and indifferent to the suffering that your crusading might be causing. And even if you started out genuinely and sincerely intending to make the world a better place, you would wake up to discover that the world was less secure, more violent, and that you had become more like the monsters you were trying to change than they had become like you. The Canada that you know today would be gone forever. Now, if you think that's an unattractive prospect, then you should vote for this resolution. And you should hope that my country comes to its senses, not that it disengages from the world and not that it doesn't defend its interests and the interests of its friends and partners, but that it stops its foolish efforts to slay monsters and instead adopts a policy of realism and restraint. America will be better off, our friends and neighbors will be better off, and the world will be better off. Thank you.
Okay, some great closing statements to wrap up a terrific debate. You now get to vote again. So if you successfully open that browser on your phone to vote at the beginning of the evening, that browser will now prompt you, if you refresh it, may even push automatically to your phone the second audience vote. If you've closed the browser because you're busy tweeting tonight's debate or otherwise down on your phone, you can go to the microsite monkvote.com. That'll reactivate the poll on your phone. You'll see the second question tonight, which is the debate motion. be it resolved, do not go hunting monsters. You click review and then you confirm your vote. We had a fantastic count on the first vote, so the app seems to be working really well, and I hope that that's your experience too. As we let that second all-important vote build, let's review where we were at the beginning of tonight's debate. On our motion, be it resolved, don't go hunting monsters, I believe it was 55% in favor of the motion and 45% opposed, which suggests that there's a lot of play in this room and that this audience could go either way after listening to what has been a terrific, let's hear it for our debaters, a terrific 2-hour debate. Thank you. Yeah. Civil, substantive. We even got to kick somebody out of the audience. That's a favorite activity of mine at Munk Debate, so thank you, sir. I hope you enjoyed the live stream. But again, I just do want to thank Toria, Mike, John, and Stephen for coming to Toronto to be part of this debate. Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up for the second audience vote. Let's see what happened. Debaters, 56 pro, 45 con, a micro swing to the pro side, so a TKO. A TKO, I think, for John and Stephen. Pretty darn close to a draw, guys. So,
Can we come back after the Iran war?
absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being part of a terrific debate. Your support